Hello there, Professor McWeeney from Public Administration 6550, Strategic Planning for Government and Nonprofit Organizations. Today we're going to talk about the second critical success factor, the organizational assessment. You're going to hear me say over and over again, one of the most crucial aspects of making a strategic plan effective. Now you have heard me say that, and I'll repeat it again. The idea of a critical success factor is that all of the elements in a project are called critical success factors, identifying those things that must work and must work at a high level for the project to succeed. We've come up with 6 critical success factors for strategic planning. You see them on the slide right here. We have the engaged leadership, we have the in-depth assessment, we have definitive goals and objectives, effective resource utilization, very important, a flexible and relevant strategic management process, managing change, and then finally, outstanding and useful performance measures. Again, the point of a critical success factor, these are not a list of desirable things. These are elements that must all be performed at the highest possible capacity for the project to work. And we've said over and over again that for the strategic plan to be effective, and you know most of them are not. We discussed that in Mod 1. But for a strategic plan to be effective, these 6 elements have to be there and they have to be done well. Today, we're going to talk about CSF2, the Candid In-Depth Assessment. Next. You know, it's funny because the assessment you would think is just intuitively the most important thing of any kind of a plan. You know, you go to a doctor because you have a headache and the doctor wants you to take a CAT scan. You can't really say you got to skip that space. Just give me an aspirin. That's not going to work on anything that's important. On anything that's important. Let me underscore that. On anything that's important. The idea of an assessment is that identifying the issues that will drive and reflect the activity, they must take place through an in-depth candid assessment. Ironically, and you'll hear me talk about it, is that a large number of agencies would prefer to skip this process. I dealt with the director of a very famous federal agency one time and just said, I'm not going to waste a lot of time doing assessments and doing studies and hiring consultants. I know what's wrong with my agency. I've been here 15 years. Let's just go to the plan. And he did what many do. They go off to a hotel and they do some stuff on notepads. They come back and they write a document. And I told him, you're making a big mistake. You cannot get treated before you have a diagnosis. The assessment is a diagnosis. And we went along, and sure enough, 6 months later, he came back to me and he said, you know, you were dead right. Is that I realized there were problems associated with HR I didn't know about. There was a performance limitation in our field offices. We had staffing issues I didn't know. The things I wanted to do just can't happen this year. And if I had done the assessment, the whole thing would have done better. That happens over and over and over again. So I'm going to stress today not only the importance of an assessment, but a way to make it very useful in your planning efforts. Go ahead. So we have some learning objectives today. It's pretty important that you understand why we're doing this. These learning objectives are tied very much to the NASPA learning objectives for public administration. But in this case, it's really important to note a couple things as we go forward. An assessment in an organization doesn't work unless it's done with candor and transparency. It doesn't work to cover up problems. There's no point doing an assessment if there's things you're not going to talk about. So beginning the assessment process means you're trying to put things on the table so they can be addressed and fixed. So there's no reason to worry about sensitive issues. If the organization has things you can't talk about, then scrap the whole thing. Don't waste your time or anybody's time because you're not going to have a document that's going to push through the problems that have to be pushed through. It's really important in doing the assessment that we distinguish among problems. Sometimes we have one problem that's facing us, you know, an emerging issue of resources or a technology meltdown, and that becomes all we talk about. But an assessment is a 360. We need to know our strengths, very important. What are we good at? And what can we rely on in a strategic plan? What are our weaknesses? What are those things that you know are going to cause us to have significant delays or program stoppages? What opportunities are out there? Oftentimes there's things outside the organization that are calling our name or potentially calling our name. And if we don't include those into a plan, we miss opportunities. And finally, what are the threats? And every organization has external threats from competitors, from funding, from complex issues and the like that make a success difficult. Part of this process is going to cause us to get familiar with those things and make sure they're integrated into the assessment. I'm going to teach you how to do a SWOT analysis. SWOT stands for strengths, weaknesses, organization, and threats. Many people do them. I'll get into that in a few slides. But this one, we're going to show you how to do it and then how to use it effectively. And finally, the end of the process should provide the organization with what we call areas of priority emphasis, meaning when the assessment is finished, you have your planning agenda. Yeah, I don't have to start all over again with what I'm going to do. You have done the work. These are the issues that has to be addressed. And the rest of the planning process is just ticking off the issues one by one and dealing with the issues and the strengths and the weaknesses with each one. So once we do the assessment, the focus of the plan gets significantly narrowed to those areas of priority emphasis. And in doing so, we'll try to identify the performance gap in every area and every program. Next. So again, what I'm looking for at the end of the process, what I'm looking for to have a good assessment is that it should provide the strategic direction for the organization, meaning how are we going to approach the problem? We're going to take it directly on. We're going to try and do it in a two-step process. How are we going to roll this plan out? How are we going to roll out the process of dealing with where we need to go? We should be able to identify the performance gaps. I'll talk about in a second. Performance gap is the difference between what we're currently doing at the level of performance and what we think we should be doing. Not the maximum, but what we think there's somewhere in between there, there's a gap in performance. The assessment provides you knowledge about that gap. And then, as I said earlier, it's the areas of priority emphasis that form the basis and the borders of the strategic plan. So with all that, why is it a critical factor? Well, it's probably obvious by now. But there's a couple things that I want to emphasize. One, it will inform, the assessment informs the vision and the direction. The assessment lets us know whether what we want is possible. It provides the context for goals and objectives. Now we know why we're doing certain goals, not just throwing a nice lofty thought out, not saying increase our production by 10% or continue our good work in the environment. Is a thing that has to be addressed in the assessment, and it finds its way into goals and objectives. It identifies, most importantly, the major obstacles and the things in the way for achieving your goals. It provides the areas of priority emphasis. It provides a focus for your strategies. And finally, it clarifies the current performance and future performances. These are the things, if not addressed, are going to be a failure in that CSF. And you remember, if one of those CSFs is missing, down goes the whole plan. So why is it so hard? Think about this for a second. We'll discuss this in class. It's very hard for several reasons. When you pull a bunch of people that work together or throughout the organization into a conference room and say, let's talk about our problems, invariably, those discussions tend to be superficial. They don't get to the real issues. They tend to be limited in scope. There's usually borders of what you can't talk about or write about because you're afraid of offending somebody sitting across the table. It's unlikely that a high-level meeting to do an assessment is going to stare at the IT manager and say, you guys can't even spell IT. There's nothing that I ever use with IT that works. So we have to start with fixing the IT before we can do any of this stuff. Now, that's a little harsh, I agree, but that's what you want to pull out in assessment. You want to know the real problems of real people and real organizations. And to the extent that the people involved in an assessment are somehow reluctant or prevented from talking like that or writing those things, again, you're going to limit the problems that are identified, limit the solutions, and limit the extent in which the agency is going to make progress. So all these limitations need to be put aside. A biggest one is sensitive topics. And I know it sounds harsh, and I don't mean to be, but think about it for a second. If you have a significantly incompetent resource management team, they're not experienced in budgets. They can't reallocate resources. They make technical mistakes in the budget. They're not highly regarded outside the little organizational unit. Can you actually do a significant plan, which usually requires reallocation of resources, without mentioning the fact that we have trouble in our budget office? These people are not, at the caliber that you would expect in an agency-wide strategic plan. If that's true, the assessment has to bring that out and make that an issue to deal with. And finally, we try not to address issues of policy that are in the performance gap because many government plans prefer to have things like increase our good efforts in transportation, increase the work we're doing with the homeless, continue to do the work. They use continue, encourage, enhance, as opposed to solve. As I said earlier, the most effective government plan in history was the Apollo project, in where President Kennedy said that by the end of the decade, we're going to put a man on the moon and bring him back safely to Earth. That's an incredible statement of concrete, definitive things. And you know what? When it's concrete and definitive, and their assessment shows what the performance gap was, they achieved it. They achieved a miraculous thing of going from never putting anybody in space to putting a man on the moon in less than a decade. The planning process drove every aspect of that project. And finally, when we do an assessment, again, think of the typical assessment where people are gathered together to talk about their problems. Most of the time, we will talk about today's problems and not the emerging ones, not the fact that the resource cycle is likely to hit next year and we should be careful about the resource commitments we make, or the fact that our IT performance is not going to keep up with the needed changes for the work that we're trying to do, or the fact that there's a significant shift in the workforce, or the fact that we have anything that's going to impact our performance. Those typically are not brought up when we're dealing with an assessment to get a strategic planning process going. That's what makes this so hard. So the assessment has a few components. I'll spend some time talking about this the rest of the session today. First of all, it has an external piece, and that means to do an effective plan that's going to transform your organization or even move the performance up significantly. The stakeholders have to be engaged and their views have to be made known. What do they think? What's our reputation? How does it work? Can they rely on us? That has to be brought into the assessment. There's policies and politics that are at play in most government programs that we have to be aware of. We can't do an assessment from a cocoon. There is significant challenges to management direction. You know, there's new administrations, new elections, new bosses, new sub-bosses that have to be factored in when you're doing a strategic plan. What those people are likely to want to pursue. There's the whole issue of competitors externally. Many people want your turf, your job, the credit for what you're doing. And then there's the notion of changing technology, which is always a factor in the external environment that has to be addressed in any 3 to 5 year strategic plan. Think how much technology has changed your life in the past 3 years. Also understand that most experts say that pace will double every 5 years. So the pace of change driven by technology is incredible. A strategic plan has got to address that if it's going to be relevant and useful. Next. Internally is where much of the action is, though, because the internal stuff drives the immediate reaction to a plan. There's the issue of resources and resource efficiency. There's the whole issue of, again, technology and technological availability to the people in the workforce. There's obviously management and organizations. Most strategic plans ultimately require a significant reorganization because you're talking about new ways of doing business. And so that has to be dealt with in an assessment. There's the issue of process efficiency. How many of you grumble about things that don't get on time or require too much paperwork or never get processed because they're complex? Process efficiency and the throughput of processes constrain many organizations. I call it the constipation of an organization, and what you have to do is take the appropriate laxative to make that thing flush. I'm serious about that. It is a critical impediment to strategic planning. And finally, there's workforce skills that we have to assess. Do we have the skills to do what others are doing, what our competitors are doing, and what we think we should be doing? And then finally, and we can't avoid it, we have to take that climate survey to understand the morale. Do we have a workforce that's excited about change, wants to weigh in, wants to be part of something good, or do we have a workforce that can't wait until their next transfer, or want to continue working the 3 years till their retirement, or are upset about decisions that have been made and have lost their morale? That is a crucial part of the assessment, because without strong morale, no strategic plan is going to be worth the paper it's written on. This is a graphic that explains the performance gap. It's just a visual that we talked about earlier. For every program, every operation, everything, anybody should, on an annual basis, get your group together and just look at these 3 lines. Okay? The performance gap is the difference between our current level of performance, which is shown there in the red line, and our desired level of performance, which is what we're going to need to make the plan effective. Okay? That gap between current performance and desired performance is what the assessment tries to address. It tries to identify it and explain it. One of the ways that the performance gap is dealt with is through what we call a SWOT analysis. And many of you have probably heard about that. SWOT stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And it's an effort to do a 360-degree assessment of your organization by looking at the things we talked about earlier, the strengths of the organization, comparing them with its weaknesses, the opportunities, and the threats. The SWOT analysis takes those two functions, strengths and weaknesses, and combines them, superimposes them with the internal factor and an external factor to give you an overall assessment of how strong your organization is relative to your strategic goals. Next. Here's a showing that tries to portray what the SWOT analysis captures when completed. Think of it as a matrix, and inside the box, everything that you need to know about the organization is documented. And with that documentation, as I'll show you in a moment, the direction you must pursue becomes clear. For example, if you look at the column on the side, you have your opportunities and threats. They're cross-referenced with strengths and weaknesses. And what happens when you look at opportunities and strengths, weaknesses and opportunities, you get a totally different view of the capabilities of the organization. So what we do with the SWOT analysis is once we list the strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats, and I will say that many of you who have done SWOT analysis probably have done this process. The listing of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats is a pretty common drill that you do when you do a strategic plan. But it usually winds up with a page called strengths, and everybody brainstorms how good we are. A page called weaknesses, and the problems are identified. Opportunities, same thing. Threats, the same things. And these are usually flip chart paper that you pin up around the whole room, and you spend the rest of the plan trying to pull from those things to make sense of what you end up doing. I'm going to share with you a different way here to use that data to give you a compelling direction in your plan, and one that so far, when I've used it, almost always produces a different outcome. And that is that you take a look, no, back, I'm not done with that, back. You take a look at the component parts of this chart, where if you can combine your strengths with the opportunities that are calling your name. If you look at your strengths and opportunities, we call those strategies you would pursue with that an SO strategy. That means I have a lot of strengths, and there are people calling my name, and let's do it. I grew up, as many of you know, my first years with the Drug Enforcement Administration at a time when the drug problem was significant. And DEA agents were very good. There was everybody wanting a DEA office. Every community in the country was asking for them, and the funding could have been as much as desired because everybody wanted one, there was a need, there was the opportunity, and many people, if they have that situation, say, let's go. And if your agency does wind up calling itself an SO, it means your strengths and opportunities are unchallenged, go for it. But if you have a weakness, even though there are opportunities, the strategy becomes different. The agency must pursue what we call a WO strategy, which means you have opportunities, they must be pursued, but you're not strong enough to take advantage of them. So your plan should not reflect something that just can't happen as if it were an SO. Your plan should reflect the fact that you've got opportunities, you don't have the capacity. Your plan should do something which maybe is a 2 or 3 step to get those opportunities. We can't go after it right away because we're not capable, we have shortages, we'll overcommit, we'll make a mistake, and we'll look foolish. It'll look like a disaster. You can't say, I'm going to put a man on the moon and never have the ability to launch the first Atlas rocket. You can't say I'm going to solve the drug problem and have no ability to do anything different in your operation. You've got to tie your opportunities to your capabilities. Same thing with threats. If you have tremendous strengths, but there are threats, I mean threats from the environment, threats from the difficulty of the problem, threats from competitors, threats from changing politics. If the threats are strong, you would then pursue what we call an ST strategy, which means you're good, keep your eye on the ball, but be very calculating in the steps you make because a mistake can be immediately be met with significant opposition from competitors, from the environment, from political enemies and the like. So it's a very cautious step towards achieving the plan. And finally, the last one is that if you have a lot of weaknesses, meaning you got lots of problems, and there are a lot of threats, it's called an ST strategy, and that's called retrenchment. Now that doesn't mean take a hike, give it up. It means develop a strategic plan based on an ST strategy, which really is circle the wagons. Try to focus our efforts on doing a good job with our mandatory stuff. Try and put things in place so we can improve our capability, but just live to fight another day. Your strategy in an ST environment should not be optimistic. It should not be far-reaching. It should simply be, let's get to the point where we can then do a credible plan sometime next year. It's a circle the wagons and fix your problem strategy. Every strategic plan, to be effective, should start by identifying its environment, passing your assessment as either SO, WO, ST, or SO. And I just went ahead and described them, but there is, again, it's high demand for services, nothing in the way. WO is high demand for services, but significant external problems, internal problems. ST is it's strong, but serious external threats. And then a WT strategy is when you have these threats and weaknesses, and it's going to be difficult doing anything significant, but you have to have a plan, and you have to plan your way out of that mess. Hello? Now, what we do is, what I just said, is we try to plot these things on a graph. I'm going to do that for a couple of examples and show you what it winds up looking at. If you look at a basic graph where you have the strengths and weaknesses on the vertical line and opportunities and threats on the horizontal line, you're going to wind up having every organization, after you do a threat assessment, environmental assessment, is going to be able to plot yourself in one of those four quadrants. Those four quadrants were symbolized by the chart we just went through. Next. I'm going to give you a couple examples and show you how we did it. Both the Drug Enforcement Administration years ago and more recently an agency called the Court Services and Offenders Supervision Agency, which is also an older plan, but both of these examples are quite good, and I'm going to continue using them because they're both true today. Next slide. Let's go to DEA first. Just talk a little bit about DEA in 2000. I'm not going to go through its whole history, but in 2000, DEA was in a position where they were trying to significantly expand their operation because the South American program didn't really work. They wanted to try to focus on internal crime issues. Domestic enforcement was the name of the game, and they decided they had to have a whole new look at their operation. Next slide. So in plotting SWOT, they took a serious look at how good they were, what they were facing, what the external threats were and the opportunities, and wanted to plot where they land on that graph. Now, the way this works is we give the list of strengths. We have good staffing, we have good resources, we have good talent, we have good technology, and the group looks at those carefully, discusses them, and then evaluates them on a scale of 1 to 5, or it can be 1 to 10, or it can be 1 to 100. For the purposes of this discussion, it's 1 to 5. And you simply say, on a scale of 5, we plot ourselves at a certain level. And then we ask the same thing for opportunities and weaknesses. And I'll show you how that played out with respect to the DEA assessment. Next slide. So when looking at the strengths of DEA, we saw that it had unquestioned expertise, that it was a really improved infrastructure over previous times. There was a highly motivated workforce. They were strong, respected capabilities, and then finally, basically unlimited resources. So in that situation, the assessment team, after discussion, after they had listed stuff on the flip charts, gave DEA a score of 4 out of 5 in identifying its threats. And you can see that the line went up to the level of strengths at a 4 level. Next. Now we look at the opportunities, and what are we facing here? Once again, they gave themselves a 4 because national priority was drugs at the time. There's unlimited demand for our services, for DEA services. There was great relationships, et cetera, and all of the opportunities that were calling for our action were such that the team evaluated the opportunities facing them as a 4 also. So you can see that the line in the graph moved over 4 spaces. Next slide. When we're talking about weaknesses, they also saw significant improvement over previous years, and they had some weaknesses, but not as significant as they've been in the years past. They were still a small workforce compared to the big agencies in government, only about 2,000 or 3,000 people. The FBI, for example, has 15,000 agents and about 20,000 staff, 35,000 people. So they were dwarfed by the other agencies. There was a succession of issues and problems that impacted on had no impact on the problem. We couldn't really say that the previous activities have been successful in limiting drugs. There was really no national focus, and there was no strategy at the time. So in looking at the weaknesses they were facing, the team gave themselves a 3, and that means you take that line and move it down 3, 1, 2, 3, and pop it where you see it on the chart. Next one. And finally, threats. This was a big one. They felt significant threats from competitors, from the nature of the problem, from the political scene. The increasing strength of the cartels was undoubtable. Increasing demand for drugs was difficult to stop. The likelihood of stopping the farmers in South America was almost impossible because that was their livelihood. At any rate, the team gave the threats they face a 5. Okay, so you mark it now over to the left, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And where that process ends is the quadrant that's going to reflect the nature and the scope and the effectiveness of your overall strategic plan. Let's look at the next slide and see what happened there. You see, right there, you wind up placing the agency through this analytical process in what we call an ST quadrant. And that ST quadrant means that you have some strengths, but you must use those strengths cautiously in a calculating way to avoid the threats that you're obviously going to face. And so the tone of the strategic plan is take advantage of your strengths, be aware of the opposition, of a competition, of a difficulty, don't overreach, and don't make a mistake. Calculating, make every move successful. And that was the strategy that they chose to move forward, and it's been eminently successful for them since that time. I was fortunate to work with an agency called the Court Services and Offender Supervision Agency for several years. This was an agency that was put in place by an act of Congress. It was given to the Attorney General of the United States to make sense of the parole function in the District of Columbia in Washington, D.C. That was a time when there was a murder a day in D.C. and violence was pretty tough. And the idea behind parole was that a parole process is supposed to deal with the issue of recidivism. Recidivism is repeat crime. And one of the things that was happening at that time, especially in D.C. and the big cities, is that about 85 to 90% of all crime was repeat crime, repeat offenders. So people commit the crime at a juvenile age, and they continue, if they're in a life of crime, they do it over and over and over again. The theory being, if the parole function can minimize that repetitive nature of crime, minimize recidivism, it's going to obviously tone down the issues, the number of criminal acts, the number of homicides, and they decided that they were going to take on, as their strategy, a reduction of homicides in D.C. by reducing the recidivism from what it was, which is 85%, to at least 50% over 5 years. And they had reason for doing that. They had done a lot of research, and they showed that when a specific kinds of activity took place, when it took place, those activities had a significant impact in recidivism in the community. And those activities collectively were, based on studies by the National Institute of Justice and the like, was a ratio. The biggest one was a ratio of 1 parole officer to every 4 offenders. That was the strongest thing, because when that ratio took place, the parole officer knew the offenders, kept track with them, understood their problems, and could intervene when there was issues. The issue there was that at the time the organization was being developed and planned, the ratio was not 1 to 4, it was 1 to 40. Every parole officer had 40 offenders to maintain contact with and could not do their job effectively. That became the problem, and that was the problem they faced in the strategic plan. It required a drug testing component, a drug treatment component, partnerships with industries taking jobs, and evaluation. Their critical success factors for that plan to reduce recidivism was that these 5 things had to be in place and be done well if they had any chance of reducing crime in the District of Columbia. Next. So let's take a look at how they did their assessment. They looked carefully at themselves. They looked at what they were doing. They understood their workforce had significant expertise in the issue of parole. They had high morals. They totally believed in what they were doing. It was their city. They had a belief in the mission, and yet it was limited by a significant amount of staffing kinds of problems that they never were able to get out of second gear. So they gave themselves, on a mature basis, a 3 on a scale of 5. That was their self-assessment. They're not a 5. They're damn good, but they're a 3. Next. When they looked at their opportunities they faced, it was interesting because they saw an unlimited opportunity, both with the need to reduce crime, with the support of the president, support of the attorney general and the Congress, and because of all of the issues that they're facing, now was the time to jump into a document or a planning process that would make a difference, and they gave themselves a 4. Now, when you're talking about our weaknesses, the things that we're not doing so well, then the laundry list is pretty large. It's a small agency. It was in development. They had just come together, 4 or 5 local civic agencies into the new agency. They didn't have priorities. They didn't have a budget, didn't have a background. They had a brand new leader. And so very generously, they gave themselves a 5, saying before they do much, they're going to have to overcome the significant weaknesses of a new agency thrown together from a lot of people who would never work together without a good infrastructure, and they have this really important job to do. So they gave themselves a 5, and you can see now that rating knocked them below the positive line in terms of the strategic plan. And we'll take a look at the last step, which was, the overall threats they faced. And they saw the threats they faced being significant as well. The mission was very complicated. There was a lack of reinforcement in the community. Nobody knew what they were talking about. There was far more parolees than jobs for them, so getting them permanent jobs was going to be difficult. So it went on and on and on and on. And so they honestly said that in terms of threats we're facing, they are pretty bad too. And they gave themselves a 5, okay, on the threat package. Now, this was a mature assessment. I was part of that, and I watched them. They were candid about their strengths, candid about their opportunities, very candid about their weaknesses. So instead of writing a plan that says we're going to build a better mousetrap, they took a look at this and they realized, next slide, that they were in a retrenchment mode. They landed in that 4th category, which isn't head for the hills, get a new job, join the private sector. It is that what we have to be successful is a near-term minimal agenda that's focused primarily on building capacity, avoiding serious mistakes, avoiding political problems, showing some growth and some progress, addressing our performance gap, and giving us our major goal to be in a position a couple years from now where we can really energize a strategy to reduce recidivism. That was a very mature strategic plan, and that particular program they put in place is still in existence in 2023. I happened to visit them last year on a trip to DC. I went in to see the place, and right in the middle of their building, at the 10-foot sign, now it was in some kind of a bronze plaque, identified those 5 elements as the core of their agency, and they were tracking their success against them. So 15, 20 years later, they used that and they kept it going, and they turned the thing from a retrenchment strategy to a pretty effective strategy, and they are among the most well-known parole officers in the United States. Next. Key thing where was they did not overshoot. They were frank with themselves, candid. They did the assessment the way the assessment is supposed to be there. And in doing so, their areas of priority emphasis became that they had to get a lot more trained people. They had to progress towards a much stronger ratio of their parolees. They had to have drug treatment on demand for these folks because so many of the problems go into drug dealing and using right away. They had to have an IT system that was going to track this stuff, and they had to have job training so that when people did come out and they did stay clean, we could plug them into jobs like Home Depot and Lowe's and places where they could get some immediate feedback. And that was their near-term strategy. Those were their areas of priority emphasis, and this became a very, very successful strategy for an agency that was really facing a lot of difficulties. And if they hadn't done this, they would have gone right in the plan about talking about reducing recidivism in a lot of ways that never would have happened. And it would have obviously been another document that's written, goes on the shelf, and never, ever read. Next. So that's the basic issue of the assessment. We'll talk about this in the lecture. The critical component for an effective assessment you've heard me say over and over again, is that it's got to be candid. You've got to be true to yourself, to your organization. You can't sugarcoat things. You can't cover them up. You can't be afraid to say them if you want to elevate the issues that are going to address the problems constraining the agency. It's a mathematical equation. You can't solve a problem unless you know what the problem is. If you can't discuss the attributes of a problem, you're not going to solve the problem. So don't even try, is my view. If you can't do the candid assessment, if you haven't got the courage to do it, save yourself the time and effort and write something else. Don't write a strategic plan. But a good strategic plan will be made much better if the people approach it with a level of candor and courage that makes a difference. See you next time.